Hi, today I'm going to talk about general settings on a camera suitable for wildlife photography. I'm not going to go into great depth on all the settings because they're very different for each type of camera. I'm going to talk about settings that are common across a range of different brands of cameras. Life used to be very simple. Wildlife photographers used either Canon or Nikon, and there were very few that used anything else. But that has all changed because Nikon and Canon were a bit slow to adopt to mirrorless systems. Sony, Fuji, Panasonic, Olympus have really got a foothold now, and many photographers are using those systems. So you really have got 6 brands that are commonly used by wildlife photographers. But the settings I'm going to talk about are common across all the ranges. We're going to start off by talking about the shooting mode, which is usually a dial on top of the camera where you can select aperture priority, shutter speed priority, manual exposure, or one of the program modes. Now if you would have a group of experienced wildlife photographers sitting around here and was to do a poll of them, you wouldn't find them all doing the same. There's room for personal opinion on this. But I'm going to suggest that the majority would probably be shooting aperture priority. There'd be quite a few shooting manual exposure, and perhaps 1 or 2 shooting shutter speed priority. Probably not very many shooting the program modes, but perhaps 1 or 2. I've been shooting on aperture priority right from when I first started. I used to do workshops on wildlife photography, and on more than one occasion somebody in the audience said, I would have thought it was logical to shoot on shutter speed priority because you're talking about a fast moving subject and you want a fast shutter speed. Well, that does sound logical, but it isn't, because if you want the fastest possible shutter speed, the way to achieve that is to open up your aperture fully. Then you've got the fastest shutter speed. If the light improves, your shutter speed will go even faster. Whereas if you start off by selecting the shutter speed, let's say you select 1/1000th of a second, and the light improves, well, your shutter speed won't increase. It will be your aperture that will close down a little bit to get the correct exposure. So if you want the fastest shutter speed that is possible with the available light, you select aperture priority and open the aperture up wide. And I think in the days of film, this was certainly the logical thing to do, because we always struggled with shutter speed. We were photographing with 64 ISO Kodachrome, and then most of us moved on to Fuji Sensor and Provia at 100 ISO. So you very rarely had a fast enough shutter speed for birds in flight. You certainly needed a sunny day to do it. So it's quite logical to use aperture priority to get that maximum shutter speed. Today things have changed a little bit. We're now shooting at extremely high ISOs, 1600, 3200 ISO. It's actually quite easy now to get a fast shutter speed. So there would be a good argument for people shooting shutter speed priority, because let's say for a bird in flight you want 2000th of a second. That's a good starting point for birds in flight. Sometimes you can go much slower. If you've got a gannet hanging in the wind, you can have a much slower shutter speed. If you're photographing a hummingbird, you need a much faster shutter speed, 5000th of a second and upwards. But for your typical wader or duck or a crow or wood pigeon in flight, 2000th of a second is a good starting point. Faster if you can, but 2000s you stand a good chance of getting it sharp. So if the light is better than that, or the light changes and becomes better than that, the advantage would be, if you stick to 2000th of a second, your aperture will close down, you'll get more depth of focus, perhaps you stand more chance of getting the bird sharp as it's flying as well. So there is this argument. If I was starting again today, I might consider using shutter speed priority as my first port of call. But the important thing is not to try and use all of them. I am using aperture priority 95% of the time, and the other 5% manual exposure. When the lighting is particularly difficult, and that can be in snowy conditions, in dull light, then I know I've got to swap to manual exposure because the camera is not going to get it right. On the other hand, in snowy conditions, if the sun is shining and the sun is coming from over your shoulder lighting up the subject, it could be that your camera does get it right. Modern light meters are actually remarkably good. But the most important thing of all is not to try and use all of them. Restrict yourselves to how many options you use. I'm going to recommend aperture priority, and bearing in mind occasionally you've got to override it and shoot manually. Next we'll look at the metering mode. Again, you get a range of options which are common across the whole range of cameras. You get spot metering, where it just meters off a center spot in the middle of the picture. Partial metering, which is just a larger spot. Center weighted, where it takes most account of the center part of the picture and the lower parts of the picture, ignores the top left and right hand corner. And then you get the evaluative or matrix metering, where it takes account of the entire scene and works out what the exposure should be. Again, if you get a group of experienced wildlife photographers, they won't all agree. They'll all have their own way of operating. But the most important thing is not to try and use all of them, and when it comes to the metering pattern, this is particularly important. The human brain cannot remember and calculate all the different options if you try and use a range of metering modes. More than once, I've read magazine articles where they suggest you should use this metering pattern for this subject and another metering pattern for a different subject. I couldn't disagree with that more. You should use one metering pattern, and then you will get used to when you have to under or overexpose, and it will vary enormously. If you're spot metering, you might have to overexpose a picture, whereas if you're using the evaluative metering, you'd have to underexpose that picture. And only by using one metering pattern will you become used to when you've got to do it which way. And I'm going to recommend the matrix or the evaluative metering. It's pretty good these days. Modern cameras do tend to get the exposure right most of the time. Okay, now we'll look at frames per second, how many frames per second you should be shooting at. Well, fairly simple one for me. I just shoot on the maximum all of the time. I tend to use the electronic shutter most of the time. The only time I'm going to use the mechanical shutter is when I'm using a flash gun, and I don't use flash very much these days. Can't remember the last time I took a picture of a bird with flash. So on the electronic shutter, whatever the maximum frames per second I can get, that's what I will shoot at, because when a bird finally takes up the right position, I want to hit the button and get as many frames off as I can. Some pictures will be spoiled by the bird blinking its eye or not quite turning its head to the right position. So even if you're shooting at 20 frames per second, sometimes you only get 2 or 3 frames when the bird has actually taken up the right posture. Some people say that when you're doing birds in flight, you're giving the autofocus more chance to focus on that subject if you shoot at slower frames per second. That's a very hard thing to prove, and I've never been able to prove it. So I basically don't take any account of that, and I shoot at the maximum frames per second. Next we'll talk about shooting JPEG or RAW. Now this is something that wildlife photographers, or I guess photographers in general, talk a lot about. Get a group of photographers together, it's a popular subject. And if you was to get this group of experienced wildlife photographers here, I'm going to guess that it would be about a 50-50 divide. Half of them shoot JPEG, the other half shoot RAW. The main advantage of shooting RAW is if you get the exposure wrong, you can recover it further with a RAW file than you can with a JPEG. And if you've got a very contrasty subject with burnt out whites and too dark areas, you can recover that better as a RAW. You can recover it quite a long way as a JPEG, and I can understand why people shoot on JPEG. It's simpler, you don't get so much disk space used up, because I tend to keep all of my RAWs. I process every file I keep, but then I keep the RAW and I keep the JPEG, the large JPEG that I get from it as well. I don't process one at a time, so I get perhaps a batch of 100 pictures in a folder, and I bring the thumbnails up in my RAW processor and I look at them, and if there's a group of about 10 where I can see they're a little bit on the dark side, I just brighten those 10 up. And then there might be another 3 somewhere else where the highlights look a bit blown, so I just reduce the highlights. I don't put a lot of time into it at this stage, and then I just tell the whole lot to get on with it and RAW process, and I go off and do something else while it's RAW processing. So I've never found it much of a headache shooting RAW, and I don't put a lot of time and effort into it. So overall, I don't think it makes a great deal of difference. If you're happy shooting JPEG, it's nothing to do with quality. The quality between shooting RAW and shooting JPEG is no different. They are the same, and you can prove that for yourself if you set your camera up to take a large JPEG and a RAW at the same time. One press of the button, you get 2 separate files, then process your RAW and look at them. They're absolutely identical. You could take it to the next level and print them, but they'd be absolutely identical. It only helps with contrasted subjects or if you get the exposure wrong. Another very important one, the ISO. What ISO should you be shooting at? Well, this is something where you'll get a huge range of opinions on this. I have a very simple policy to it. Every camera is different. So whenever I buy a new camera, first time I go out with it, I set it up on the tripod and I focus on the distance, on the horizon. And then I put it into manual focus and I put it way out of focus, so it just becomes a blur. And then I take a whole series of pictures. I start at the lowest ISO, let's say it's 50 ISO, then 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400 and onwards to the top of the range. One picture at each ISO. Oh, and I try and pick an area where there's shadows in the background as well, darker areas, because noise or grain shows up worse in the darker areas than the lighter areas. Then when I get home, I look at these pictures and I just flick through them on the computer, and I'm trying to decide where does the grain start to appear. Now notice I did whole stop increments, 100 to 200 to 400. I don't mess about with 1/3 increments, because the difference between 1/3 increments is so slight you'll never be able to see it. But if you do whole stop increments, you stand a chance of seeing the difference between the different ISOs. Having said that, it's becoming more and more difficult with modern cameras. With my Canon gear, you could see the difference between 400 and 800. It was obvious. It suddenly got noisy. These days you can go up to extremely high ISOs and the noise hardly shows. So I do hesitate now when I'm looking at them, the pictures with my Olympus gear, but I have decided that when I get to 400 ISO I can see no difference. So 100 ISO, 200 ISO and 400 ISO look exactly the same with my Olympus cameras. When I go to 800 ISO, I can now see a little bit of noise has crept into the picture. It's ever so slight, it's marginal, but I can see it. So therefore 400 ISO becomes my default setting. When the light is very good, my bird is static, it's not moving about, I don't need a fast shutter speed, I drop down to 400 ISO. I don't drop any lower because I can't see any improvement when I do. And I'm doing this test with an out of focus blurred background where you can see the noise best, if there is any noise to be seen. I'm very happy to shoot at 800 ISO because although there is a little bit of noise, it's absolutely marginal, and when I get to 1600 it's still very, very good. So I'm also happy to shoot at 1600. When you get to 3200, yes, the noise is creeping in, and cameras are going to keep getting better and better, but it's very much something that will vary from model to model. So with your camera, the next time you're out, it's well worth doing this test and deciding for yourself rather than listening to anybody else where you think the noise starts to become a nuisance. And finally, we'll look at focusing points. Which are the options on focusing points should you use? If I'm doing a static subject and I've got a bird sitting on a branch, I will use one focusing point and I'll use the one shot focusing mode. So when I half depress the button, the focus locks. And I'll put that focusing point onto the bird's eye, because the bird's eye is critical. If you haven't got the tip of the tail sharp, nobody will notice, but if you haven't got the eye sharp, everybody will notice. So I put a single focusing point onto the bird's eye, and there's two ways of doing that. You either move the camera slightly, line it up onto the bird's eye, the focusing point, then half depress the button, then recompose your picture, or there's usually a joystick on the back of the camera and you can move that focusing point around. I do both, and I do it probably about 50-50, whichever just feels the most convenient at the time. If I'm doing a moving subject, then usually I have to have more than one focusing point active, and I'm now going to be in continuous focus mode. So when I half depress the button, the focus will keep changing as the bird moves about and I can follow the bird. I'm going to need more focusing points active because it's very difficult to keep a single focusing point onto the bird. So let's say I have a cluster of 3x3 focusing points in the middle of the picture, and I try and keep those on the bird and follow it around. Now it all depends on how fast and erratic the flight is. Do something like a swallow or a house martin, small bird, going all over the place, I'm probably going to have more focusing points active for that. I'll have every focusing point active that's available, so it fills the frame up. But generally speaking, the less focusing points you can have active, the better, because you stand more chance of keeping the bird in focus. Some cameras are more prone to jumping onto the background than others. I was using Canon for decades and they were very prone to jumping onto the background. My Olympus cameras very rarely jump onto the background. So it does depend upon your camera, but general rule is the less focusing points active, the better.
Thanks for watching.